ISFNR. I'm very pleased to be here, if only virtually. I wish it could be in person, perhaps some other time. Now, I'm a historian, and I was invited as a historian. I'm not going to pretend that I'm a folklorist or an anthropologist. So my question is what you might be able to take away from the history of emotions that has developed rapidly over the past 2 decades or so. And that's going to be the focus of my talk today. The way I'm going to go about speaking about this is in a couple of steps. I will first introduce you to what I think is manifestly a boom in emotions research. Then I will turn to the question of where this boom might come from, look at some of the genealogical threads, the beginnings and the histories, how this has played out. And then thirdly, introduce you to some of the major trends in this subdiscipline or this field of the historical discipline. Fourthly, home in on some of the key concepts that have developed by way of analytical language. And fifthly and finally, well-nigh impossible. You would have introduced a sentence like that with, I think that. So we see a shift in everyday language from a language of cognition, of thinking, to a language of feeling. In advertisements, in everyday culture, emotions are absolutely everywhere. There are products that are named emotion. There's a vacuum cleaner that's called Emotion 2000 or something like that. And here you see an example of how a well-known soda manufacturer uses emotion in its slogans. Concepts or ideas or trends like emotional intelligence and an EQ and emotional intelligence quotient have become common knowledge. People speak about this all the time, and in the rubric of self-help books like this one become worldwide bestsellers. And the question is, what led to this boom? How do we actually get there? And I think what are operative are a couple of more long-term trends and some more short-term events, so that we have a kind of conjuncture of these two more long-term, more short-term developments. So one of the larger trends has been that in psychology, within the discipline of psychology, behaviorism has been succeeded by all kinds of forms of research, for many of which emotions became an okay, acceptable topic. This happened somewhere in the 1960s and 1970s. That's one of the more long-term trends that has led to this current boom, I believe. Second wave feminism was key. Second wave feminism, the 1970s women's movement, was key in revalorizing emotions which were coded or deemed in a lot of culture as being associated with women. It has been about giving them a better reputation. That was one of the hallmarks of sort of the programmatic incentives of second wave feminism. As for more short-term developments, I personally think, not everybody agrees with me, but I personally think that the attacks of September 11th, 2001 were very important. So 20 years ago, I think this is the case because on the one hand, what this seemed to signify was a kind of physicality, something that was considered absolutely visceral, that was hard to understand with the available analytical instruments of post-structuralism, which place a premium on language as a form of mediating social reality. And just think of the thumping bodies of the people who jumped from the Twin Towers. That was considered something so new and bodily, visceral, that it couldn't really be assimilated with the available conceptual tools. But also, one had to try and explain the motivations of the historical actors, the terrorists themselves. And people thought that sort of the available rational choice explanations were insufficient to explain their actions when resorted to hatred, strong emotions that motivated them. And so 9/11, I think, worked as a kind of catalyst in accelerating a turn away from the linguistic term, a turn away from placing a premium on language, as had been the case in post-structuralism, or some call it postmodernism, that had been hegemonic for the past 2 decades or so. And so I think it was these kind of 2 more long-term trends and this more short-term event that really created kind of conjuncture after which the boom of the history of emotions really got off the ground. Now, let's look at this question in a bit more depth and ask where the history of emotions actually came from. Now, historians actually, if you look at it, historians have always written about emotions. And I could have started in many places, but here's one attempt. So if you look at an ancient historian like Tacitus, and you read through this quotation, you will quickly notice that what we have here is an understanding of emotion that's not something that's inside a person in a realm of the soul or the psyche that then gets expressed through language or through bodily signs, but rather what you see here is something that is learned and that depends on questions of gender, for instance, a social setting. So at a burial, you do show tears. So tears are not always just a linear expression of an emotion of grief that overpowers you, as it were, but rather is something that's deployed in a specific social setting by people who are differentiated according to all kinds of things, among them, among others, gender. We really don't have a history, an intellectual history of how historians in the West over the centuries wrote about emotions. We have a couple of islands of knowledge, as it were. We know something about German historicism in the 19th century, but we know very little about how Renaissance historians or how Mabillon or Gladenius and others wrote about this. What's then taken often as the beginning of the history of emotions is an article by this first generation of the so-called Annales school in France that was hugely influential. It was around a journal of the Annales, and that sort of marked the beginning of social history. And one of these first generation historians, Lucien Febvre, actually gave a talk at a conference in 1938 and then published his article in 1941 in the Annales. It was, of course, against the backdrop of fascism, especially German Nazism, that he realized how important emotions actually were. Here you see a quotation, and what this quotation really says is, no, of course, we don't know what it meant when a historian writes about Napoleon having a fit of rage or any such thing, because we don't know how, in that particular historical cultural setting, the expression of emotions was structured. We don't know whether it was okay for a politician like Napoleon to show rage, whether it was okay for other members of society to show emotion, whether it was okay for men or women to show emotion, and so on. So it's a plea by Favre to actually to go away from what a lot of historians have been doing, namely superimposing, transposing their own notions of emotion to historical actors in the past in a sort of easy, not very self-reflective way, and rather to stop and to think, hold on, what's going on here? What kinds of rules structure the expression of emotions in a particular historical setting or moment? Now, that said, what Favre did not yet think possible was that the rules governing the expression of emotions in a particular historical setting might have feedback loop effects on how these emotions are actually experienced by historical actors. This is still very much within a realm of there are certain feelings, those are unchangeable, and then there are filters or rules, how they can be expressed in all kinds of settings. That was Favre. We know even less about how emotions figured in the writings of so-called non-Western historians. Really, we're at the very beginning of this kind of intellectual historical work of retracing these genealogies. At the time of Favre, a little later, in ancillary fields such as sociology, historical sociology, a lot of you will be familiar with this book. Others were developing grand narratives, if you will, grand récits. So Norbert Elias, after emigrating from Germany, published this book in Switzerland. It really wasn't noticed at the time and only had its heyday after translation into English in 1969. But this book actually offers a kind of grand narrative, a master narrative of emotional development, as you will. To him, the story of modernity. To Elias, the story of modernity is one of increasing emotional control. It was really with the Renaissance and with the Reformation in Europe that historical actors learned to control their childlike or repress their childlike feelings. It was very much in a Freudian psychoanalytical mode. So if you repress it in one place, it comes out in another. Elias considered sports, athleticism as an outlet for emotions. What this narrative did, supplying this narrative, as some have argued, include especially the historian, the medievalist historian of emotions, Barbara Rosenwein, is it has absolved a lot of historians from the necessity to design long-term studies across the divide of the beginning of modernity with the Renaissance, with the Reformation. They've simply started after that, rather than they took it as a priority that there was this change. And her plea has been to actually construct more longitudinal studies, and she herself has taken that up, and others are beginning to do so as well, to move away from this master narrative that is still very much latent after Elias put it out. The history of emotions as a self-described field, as a field that calls itself history of emotions, really only came into being during the 1980s in the United States. And key here was the social historian Peter Stearns and his then wife, Carol Zizowitz Stearns. They wrote a very influential article in the American Historical Review about the history of emotions, and they really invest a lot of energy in institutionalizing the history of emotions, which they saw as a part of social history. Here you see some of the books that were published in a series that they edited. And it was, however, interestingly, this fell flat. It really was, the series had to be discontinued. It didn't have the kind of success that they were expecting. And it is, and this is my contention, it was really only after 9/11 that the current history of emotions that this boom started. And this is of course a coincidence, but maybe it's a good mnemonic device. One day after 9/11, the key theoretical empirical work to date, still is the most influential one, was published by this historian / anthropologist William Reddy, teaches at Duke University, The Navigation of Feeling, a Framework for the History of Emotions, published on September 10th, 2001. Now, so what I would argue is that actually the current boom and the current history of emotions in its sort of post-2000s inflection is not part of the influence of post-structuralism in historiography, but rather a post-post-structuralist moment. It marks a post-post-structuralist, post-postmodern moment. It comes at a moment when increasing numbers of historians felt uncomfortable with considering much of social reality mediated through language, and that the task of the historian was to analyze the rules by which this language worked, the rhetorical modes, et cetera, and rather to return to something that they considered more bodily, more visceral, and somehow emotions seemed like the place or the space in which one might locate that more visceral, more corporeal something. There was enormous institution building following 9/11. So here are just some of the centers that were founded in London, in Australia, in Berlin. The Berlin one I worked at for 4 years, run by the historian Ute Frevert. And here are some of the book publications, and I could have listed many more and more recent ones that come out as part of this recent development. Now, let's move to some of the key trends in this newer history of emotions. So I think if you have to talk about sort of one major, large, overarching narrative, it is that in the West, until about the middle of the 19th century, much of emotion talk took place in fields such as rhetoric, theology, philosophy, and literature. And it was only it was with the development of modern experimental psychology after the middle of the 19th century, especially with the foundation of the first experimental psychological laboratories in Leipzig, Wilhelm Wundt and others, in the 1860s, that psychology became the dominant discipline in which emotion talk takes place. And it is still the case today. So I think then it makes sense to say that one of the key trends is going to be that the history of emotions has to be a history of science, because that's the main access to disciplines such as psychology. Now, let me give you an example how this plays out, because it's not just sort of a simple application or transfer of ideas of conceptual baggage, as it were. Consider this sort of knowledge or this image that's out there. It's the idea that emotionality is gender coded, that men are rational, women are emotional. This is still very prevalent, virulent nowadays. I'm sure many of you have heard it, and here it's expressed in this movie by Richard Linklater of 2013. Now, where does this come from? Where does this idea actually come from? Where does this idea come from that you can sort of neatly distinguish between rationality and emotionality as sort of a binary image where you switch it on and switch it off? as it were? Well, actually, and this is based on the findings of a historian of science, historian of medicine, Otniel Dror, what Dror shows us is that some of the earliest experiments in psychological laboratories of the 1870s were experiments about emotion. And what all of these experimental designs used was a zero state and certain recording techniques where you have a baseline, a zero state, you stimulate something, a test object, a person, or an animal. You believe that that animal is sort of in a zero state of emotion, so it's got no emotionality. Then you, I don't know, hurt it or something, and then you study some of the physiological reactions and you get a response. And you can show it in a graph. It's really the baseline and then the spike in the graph, right? The arousal. That's the idea. So his argument is that actually, Dror's argument is that actually the idea, this binary image of emotionality versus non-emotionality, or emotionality versus rationality, is certainly not a function of nature, but it's a function, it's a result of a certain experimental setting, experimental practices. It's a praxeological, Bourdieuian approach to the history of science. And they grew out of these recording techniques, the baseline, the graph, the zero state, that our folk idea of this binary idea, that it actually comes from. Let me give you another example. So there is a very influential theory out there in psychology that's called the basic emotions paradigm or theory. And it's the idea that you can neatly differentiate emotions by emotion words, so that, say, anger, fear, happiness are clearly distinguishable, that the emotional states map onto this language that I just used in English, right? But if you think about it, by the way, if you think about it, just like the binary idea of emotionality versus rationality doesn't conform to our own everyday knowledge. Are we ever not emotional? Well, there might be different temporalities at work, right? There might be different moods, but even in our sleep, we're always emotional in some sort of way, right? And just like that, and similarly with basic emotions, it's very hard to believe that they can be neatly distinguished. So how do you distinguish the fear when faced with an existential threat, say a poisonous snake that you encounter in the woods? How do you distinguish that from the fear that we voluntarily, deliberately induce in ourselves, and that's mixed up with lust and pleasure when we watch a horror movie? Anyway, that's sort of how our own everyday knowledge, there's a disjuncture between our everyday knowledge and what these theories tell us. Anyway, with the basic emotions, the theory is that they can actually be read out from faces, and that they leak through, that's the word that they use, leak through what they call display rules. Display rules is culture and history. It's you learn to smile or to make a certain face in a certain social setting to conform to certain rules, but these experimental psychologists claimed your true emotions actually leak through, and you can read them from the micro movements of your facial muscles. And they developed a system that they patented, the facial action coding system, through which you can read out these true emotions. And this theory underpins a lot of security research at airports and so on. A lot of money was poured into this. Nowadays, a lot of experimental psychologists think that it's actually defunct, that it doesn't work, and so on. But it has really filtered into everyday life as well. This movie, for instance, Pixar movie, was consulted by a student or a major proponent of the basic emotions theory, Dacker-Keltner of the University of California, Berkeley, and it's precisely based on the idea that these emotions can be personified and are neatly, easily distinguishable from another and not mixed up. Now, here's one well-known developmental psychologist, Jerome Kagan, who begs to differ. He says that we should agree to a moratorium on the use of single words such as fear. We should write about emotional processes with full sentences. So that's also very much contested and disputed. But as you, I think, will see, the first trend is going to be history of science for the history of emotions. A second trend is going to be about legal history and emotions. So take for instance, the ways in which a murder that is not intentional, that's not premeditated, but that's a function, a result of affect, out of affect, is considered less bad and less subject to prosecution. And here you have a quote, some of the echoes of this earlier idea, which goes back to ideas of the duel and so on, how this has infiltrated legal language and is with us to this very day. So one other trend is going to be the legal history of emotions. A third trend is going to deal with norms, actually. Now, here's a sort of quick example. Look at this family photograph from the United States towards the end of the 19th century. And you'll notice is that nobody's smiling. And then look, zoom forward 50 years, half a century, and everyone's smiling here. Now, unless you think that the people in the second picture were really happy and the one in the first picture were unhappy, you will quickly come to the conclusion that this is the result of social processes, norms, changing norms of how to display emotion in a family photograph in that kind of setting. And then these kinds of historians who are interested in emotional norms, they end up often having sort of economic, social, etc. explanations, the rise of toothpaste, dental industry, and so on, the necessity to show a smile, teeth as a marker of social class, etc., etc. How did they, well, here's another variant, actually. This is by a sociologist, and this is one of the classics of sociology by Arlie Hochschild, a book called The Managed Heart. This is a book that marked a departure from Irving Goffman's idea of social masks. Hochschild looked into the social mask theory and the idea that we play these roles in social settings and said, hold on, there's something more that's going on here. And her case studies were two. One was flight attendants at a US airline and the way they were told to smile and see and be polite. And the second was the opposite, it was debt collectors. Now, with the flight attendants, what she noticed in her empirical research was that these flight attendants were taught to not just smile and fake happiness, but actually to be happy, right? It wasn't enough to just smile. So her argument was that that when you put on a mask, it's more than what Goffman said. Not only do you put on a uniform, as it were, but you also need to give a couple of inches of your own skin. And that all kinds of emotional dissonances and forms of alienation happen because of this demand to go beyond faking and to actually mean it and be authentic. That was her argument. So that's also part of the examination of the history of emotional norms. So to study these shifts in feeling rules, what kinds of sources have historians turned to? And the Stearns, you already saw Peter Stearns as the first historian who put forward the history of emotions as a self-descriptive subfield. They said, on the one hand, you're supposed to look at advice literature. So it was very much a modern story because in pre-modern times, there's no such thing as advice literature. And then you compare that with ego documents. So you look for the norms in the advice literature, and then you look, for instance, when you have a shifting norm in the advice literature, how that filters down into diaries, letters, memoirs, etc. And when you see conflicts in there, then it gets really interesting, as it were. And a fourth trend is the Begriffsgeschichte, or the conceptual history of emotions. And sort of the easiest way to approach this, and the example I'm going to give is the lexical, what's called the lexical Begriffsgeschichte, the lexical conceptual history of emotions. So you compare, for instance, two dictionary or encyclopedia entries, and you look at shifts in the semantics, in the meaning. And I know that a lot of you are working on fear at this Congress. So for instance, you will notice that in pre-modern times, but even in many dictionaries in the early 19th century, you will still have some transcendental notion in fear, that fear is caused by transcendental forces, or that fear of God or some transcendental force is considered an ideal. And that really goes away later on. We lose that, right? So those are the kinds of changes that you can quickly notice through this kind of lexical conceptual history of emotions. The question really becomes, the question that really is at the center, and that people will always ask when you give a talk as a historian of emotions, is with, okay, you've got a change in meaning, you've got a semantic shift, but does this really signify a shift in how emotions were really felt? What feelings felt like? Does it signify a shift in experience? And that's sort of the key question that I'm going to puzzle with a bit more in the remainder of this talk, of this lecture. Now, let me turn to some of the major concepts that have developed so far. So William Reddy, remember the navigation of feeling, put forward a concept that he called the emotive. And he took it from the philosopher of language, John Austin, from the constitutive and the performative, two terms by Austin. And according to Reddy, when you make an emotional utterance, when you say, I am happy, when you say, I am happy, you make an utterance that is both constitutive and performative. It both says something about the state of the world, and it enacts a change upon the world as a performative function as well. So it's lodged in between that binary that Austin left us with. So it describes the world and it changes the world. And how so? So he bases this on actual cognitive psychology that he takes his theory from. And he argues that when you say I am happy, you are perhaps describing a way in which you feel, but you're also enacting a change upon that, because you start wondering and you start triggering these open-ended processes. Am I really happy? Well, maybe not. I'm also other things at the moment. So your happiness actually decreases. Or on the other hand, it might work to actually enhance and make your happiness stronger, because you will crowd out other coexistent, co-present emotional states. And according to Reddy, this is always open-ended. You never really know how it plays out. It's fundamentally indeterminate. That's the nature of it. Another concept that was developed, it's been very influential, is that by the medievalist historian Barbara Rosenwein, and it's about emotional communities, which are bound by norms, et cetera, et cetera. Often they map onto other communities, such as a guild, a monastic order in the Middle Ages, and so on. And unlike sort of a lot of modern theories, according to her, you can switch quite easily between different emotional communities in the course of short periods of time. So it's not this notion, not yet this notion of an autonomous, authentic self where you're thinking, feeling, your expressions and your actions need to be in some sort of harmony, but there can be a lot of co-presence and contradiction between these three entities. That's a concept that's also been very influential. The question has been, where do you end? How large can an emotional community be? And some of us have worried that when it gets too large, when you, for instance, move to the level of the nation, that then it becomes unproductive, and you lapse into some sort of old kind of folk psychology, Völkerpsychologie, and make sweeping generalizations about entire huge collectives, and so on. Interestingly, according to her, this includes textual communities. So this is really interesting. So mediation can be part of it. Monks who assimilate similar texts in a similar way through bodily practices, and here she really uses the elaborate, sophisticated history, literature, and the history of reading in the Middle Ages. They can incorporate a text and form a community with people across distances. A third concept is by the historian of emotions, historian of the queer experience, queer historian Benno Gamma. This is the emotional styles, concept of emotional styles. And according to Benno, what you have is a dimension of space that plays a much larger role. It has an agentic force, has some kind of agency. Where, in what kind of spatial arrangements, settings, we actually feel and express feelings to him is very important. And finally, and fourth, is that of emotional practices, drawing on Pierre Bourdieu, the praxeological French sociologist, Monique Scher, an ethnohistorian, so someone working at the interstices of history and cultural anthropology. Monique Scher has introduced this very sophisticated concept that I personally find very productive. Her concept really helps us, I can't get into detail, is that it helps us, or gestures towards, it's a nod towards helping us move beyond this idea that there's a huge gap between what's interior experience and external discourse. Ultimately, this binary maps onto the nature versus culture binary. I'll get to this in a moment. I just wanted to flag it. This is really, to me, one of the key questions. So the question then that I mentioned earlier of whether we're talking about emotional experience, it looks like it could become a non-question, because that very binary of experience located in the interior of the body and discourse located at its periphery is itself a product of history, and not at all a given, an absolute. She distinguishes, Scher does, between these different kinds of practices, and I can't get into it, but that's also very helpful. What I want to warn about, and my warning would have been more strident about a decade ago when we were still in the midst of the neuro craze, the NeuroBoom, is big or deep history or affect theory. I don't know how the inroads are that it's made in anthropology, folklore studies, but in literary studies, visual studies, and so on, it's certainly huge, still is. To this day, major theorists are Deleuze, Brian Masumi, and others. Some of the examples, an affect theory reader, major books by Masumi, and the key book in history, something on deep history that also makes a lot of use of affect studies and theories about emotion based, grounded in affect theory, or a certain appropriation of certain hypotheses actually from affective science, emotions research, from experimental psychology, neuroscience especially. What distinguishes affect theory? Well, it's a concept of emotion. Emotion is entirely, affect is different from emotion in that it's entirely bodily, right? It escapes signification through gesture, language, what have you. It's non-signified. It's an intensity, as Masumi calls it. It operates below the threshold of consciousness. It is not subject to volition or intentionality. You can't really influence it. Let me give you an example what affect is. So this is one of the key hypotheses from a neuroscientist about the two roads to fear. Joseph Ledoux, and this image has been very influential. So when you go through the woods and you encounter, your retina gets hit by a stimulus like this, what looks like a snake. What first happens is in about 12 milliseconds, these are very fast processes, that signal travels to your amygdala. And you have a quick and dirty reaction, as he calls it, that prepares your body for a fight or flight response. So your blood pressure increases, your heart rate goes up, your muscles tense, you can run away or you can stay and fight. In the meantime, in about twice the time, in about 24 milliseconds, now we're talking about thousandths of a second, right? The same information travels to the upper part of your brain, where cognition is thought to take place. And there, in the cortical parts of the brain, cognitive processes are said to take place, such as, well, okay, is this really a snake? Yes, it is a snake. It's not just a stick or something, a snake-like object. Is it alive? Okay, yes, it is alive. Or it's not alive. It is alive. If it's not alive, then your cortex kind of tells your amygdala to calm down, and your body stops being tense. If it's alive, is it a poisonous snake? And so on, and then you really react. This is the kind of image. I mean, I demonstrate in the classroom with students by clapping my hands, and interestingly, even though they see the clap coming, they will still startle, and if you were to study their pupils, they would dilate and so on. So you have a bodily reaction that they can't really control. That's supposed to be affect before they understand, oh, it's just the professor clapping into their hands. It's not sort of nobody's shot or nothing dangerous, nothing existentially threatening has happened. But this is ultimately the concept of affect that underpins this huge body of theory, affect theory, that's been incredibly influential, especially in literary studies and some other fields. I think we still do better with a concept of emotion. The science underpinning affect has been shown false. A lot of these hypotheses don't work. And I think we do much better with a concept that leaves a dimension of not just corporality, but also cognition and sociality, emotions being fundamentally social and relational, always addressed to others, other beings that we are in contact with, that leaves room for volition, that leaves room for consciousness, and so on and so forth. So I personally believe that emotion is the much more productive and better concept. Now, where might this field, the history of emotions, go in the future? Let me offer, by way of conclusion, let me offer some thoughts. So the question is, why is this history of emotions so incredibly counterintuitive, right? Why do you, when you tell other people that you work on the history of emotions, people who have never heard about it, why do they say, well, really? Really? Is there a history of emotions? Isn't that one of the few universals of the human universals? The universals? Isn't that perhaps a dividing line between us and non-human animals? And so that's still out there. That's a huge, now that itself, that idea, that myth is a function of culture and of a certain historical moment that can be explained. So what we're dealing with is an abiding myth or bequest, historical bequest of a definition of emotion as something that's cross-cultural, that transcends history, that is located in the inner parts of the body, and that is really a site of where I am completely on. Right? You don't know my feelings. You can't understand my feelings. Right? This kind of unadulterated, unaffected, unchanged subjectivity, where my subjectivity crystallizes in its purest form. That's the myth, or that's the bequest, that's the baggage we're dealing with. Let's just home in on this idea of this authentic, unadulterated subjectivity. Your discipline, or its sister, the cultural anthropology, just by traveling in space, but in our time, has shown that it just doesn't work that way. Just take this key ethnography, the study from the 1980s by Catherine Lutz at sort of the height of postmodernist, post-structuralism in cultural anthropology of emotions, and she showed that people living on this atoll in Polynesia, that their notion of anthropology was of emotion was fundamentally different. They call it Nunawan. Actually, one wonders whether we can translate it into emotion, the English emotion word, because they thought of them as so fundamentally relational that what I feel, myself, my I does not end with you, right? That what I feel, you feel as well, that we're connected in such deep ways and such effective ways from our perspective that actually perhaps emotion doesn't really capture the deep relationality and sociality of emotion. So travel in space in a discipline like cultural anthropology has been very influential to attack, to contest some of these myths that I just outlined a few minutes ago, especially the myth of unadulterated emotions as the site of unadulterated subjectivity. Travel in history as well. Just think about the trained displays of grief, the wailing women in Egypt that we know from these kinds of artifacts, these murals from Egyptian times. So same story. So is a history of emotions really possible? Can we ever get at what people really felt, at their experience, to pick up this question for the third time that I consider really the crux, or can we just talk about historical, cultural, social constructions of emotions? And what I would like to suggest is that actually it's a question mal posée. It's the wrong way to pose this question, because it's based on a false dichotomy that it itself is a product of history. It maps onto the nature-culture divide, and that itself only came into being in the late 18th century, with, for want of a better term, through secularization, came into being. So nature needed to become that place to which something hard, a fundamentum absolutum, was attached. Before that, nature was considered, in pre-modern times, nature was considered much more malleable. You didn't have the stark dichotomy between culture and nature. So very crudely put, very broad brushstrokes, with the death of God, you needed to have a new force that was quasi-transcendental. Nature took that place. And it's only with that that you got this hard dichotomy between hardwired emotions and culturally constructed expressions of emotions, discourse, et cetera, et cetera. What we need to get at, I think, is we need to recapture some of that holism that characterized talk about emotions before secularization, before the late 18th century. So what I'm suggesting is that actually is one step further. It's a bit more complicated. I'm suggesting that we need to take seriously the fact that people following the late 18th century thought of emotions through a Cartesian lens, through these dichotomous lens, but that actually they don't work that way. So the fact that they thought that way about emotions had feedback loop effects in how they actually experienced them, how they lived emotions. But that need not be, that's not the best theory, the sort of absolute theory, ultimate theory of how to think about emotions. In truth, emotions are something much more holistic. That's what I'd like to leave you with as a thought of where I think we might go in the future. Thank you very much for your attention. I wish you all the best for your Congress.
Hi, it's really nice to have you here with us, and thank you for this very inspiring and knowledgeable lecture you gave us, showing us not just the key concepts, but also the genealogy of the field and new concepts, and not just in historiography, but as well in psychology and even neurosciences, etc. So thank you for that, and thank you for joining us and accepting the invitation to be a keynote speaker at the Folklorist Conference. And thank you also for accepting the invitation to participate in the collection of essays we published, Encountering Fear. We have also your text there on soldiers and emotion in Russian military psychology, post-war Russian military psychology. So thank you also for that. And all our participants of the Congress did get, I think, the copy of this collection of essays, so they can download it. So while we are waiting others to join us, I will have this opportunity to, or take advantage of this space for a few remarks or questions for you. Well, first, one thing, I invite everyone that join us on Zoom, not via Vimeo. You can ask questions live by joining Zoom meeting, going to the Congress page of the schedule for today and pressing this big blue button. So you can join with your picture and sound via Zoom. If you want to pose questions in Vimeo, that's okay. It will be read to Professor Plamper. So my first question or comment on your lecture would be, you find that 9/11 was a kind of trigger for the study of emotions, for the field of history of emotions to emerge. What do you think about the memory studies that actually started to grow after 1989? Which was quite a significant year all over the world, at least in Western Hemisphere, and which brought not in the forefront the commemorative practices and rituals and the politics of remembering, but also this process of mobilization and reconciliation of private versus public emotions. So what do you think, what was the role of memory studies on history of emotions? You can find the relation here. And maybe one more question for you before others join us. I do not see any raised hands, so I have a little bit of time. You mentioned Norbert Elias and his civilizing process and his thesis that the society takes shape by repressing certain emotions and promoting certain rights and emotions itself. So in the contemporary society, which we can find is quite immersed in this atmosphere of fear and anxiety. What do you think, which feelings or emotions are repressed today?
Thank you. Thank you for having me, first of all. Thanks for inviting me. And as I think everyone has been saying at the Congress, I wish it were in person. We are embodied human animals, and it's much better when it is in person. But what can we do? So your first question about 9/11 and memory studies, I think certainly the history of emotions has not been very sophisticated or successful in factoring in the fact that most often what we're dealing with is actually memory of social reality, let's call it that. It hasn't really taken on board many of the advances made in memory studies, from Halbwachs to the Assmanns, and so on. So that's the preliminary, I guess, that I would say. It's interesting that you asked this question. I was listening to the BBC this morning, and there was World Service, and there was an interview with a firefighter from the Twin Towers who lost his brother, also a firefighter, in the 9/11 attacks, because we're now nearing the 20th anniversary. Yeah. And I started rummaging through my memory, because the way he was talking about it, and the way the reporter asked the questions, I remember that there must have been a tipping point. There was a time after 9/11, a couple of years, when this was really, really solemn or sacred almost, when people's voice would start cracking if they just started speaking about it, and so on. People would be moved to bodily signs of emotion, tears, etc., just when communicating about it. And there must have been, something must have happened over the past 20 years. And when is that? When was that? And why? And how does it happen? And is there a logic or a certain pattern to something like this? Does a certain amount of time have to pass before the emotionality in communicating in real time about an event as traumatic as 9/11, the emotionality stops being there? So I don't know. But these are questions I was moved to today. So my short answer is I don't really have an answer to the question. It's a good one, and it's something that historians need to work on much more to kind of bring together the history of memory studies from various fields with the history of emotions. One thing
because with this big anniversary of 1989 and bringing down the Berlin Wall and all these emotions coming at the forefront, first with cameras all over the place, it was very emotional, and also spilled over into the sciences. So it was not something that didn't have this emotional impact. So, okay, but
I mean, one thing last thing I'm going to say about this question is that one thing I'm very critical of is the idea of transgenerational trauma. In general, a notion of trauma that's entirely embodied, kind of Bessel van der Kolk, Kathy Caruth, that kind of notion of trauma I'm very critical of, together with others, with Ruth Lees and so on, and the idea of transgenerational trauma, because I think the causalities don't work. People explain things in the present through trauma way past in ways that could go either way.
Sorry,
okay.
you can.
I can come back to Elias later if you wish. What I think people are raising their hands.
People are here raising their hands, so I don't want to monopolize this. Maybe we can leave it at the end. So Evelina and Renata have questions. I don't know, Evelina, you are first, maybe, so you can start.
First of all, thank you for your excellent lecture, and I have one question or two, but they're connected. what do you think about William's already polemical text against constructivism? Because I think in that text he introduced his term emotive, and he was not very satisfied, so to speak, with ethnographic work about emotions. And the other question, I think it's also connected with that. Linguist Anna Wierzbicka, I think, was first who point out that problem of different names for individual emotions through language and thus culture. Some languages have no word for some emotions, and the other around, or some have one word which cover more emotions. But yet she was not thinking that that basic emotions could be negligible, because without them she couldn't develop her natural semantic meta languages. So can you, I'm curious, what do you think about those problems?
Yeah, thank you. Tough questions. I mean, about the first one, Reddy, you were right, especially in that first article, what was 1998 article against constructionism. I think he was spot on in pointing out that there are contradictions in some of the ethnographies that appeared at the height of constructionism in the 1980s. So, for instance, if Benedict Grima talks about Pashto women, and when moralizing language seeps into her account of what happens to second and third wives once they join the household, and the first wife is there, and the mother-in-law, and there is moralizing language that seeped into that, and I think he was correct in pointing out that there mustn't be. If you take social constructionism seriously, you can't really have a vantage point from which to critique that kind of inequality, imbalance, asymmetry in the family structure among Pashto women in Pakistan, if I remember correctly. Oh. So I think he was spot on in pointing out that contradiction. I am not sure that the extrapolation to this huge question of how to continue to have a vantage point to make moral judgments tout court in general, sort of the dilemma of post-structuralism. I'm not sure that emotions will do the job, or that his going to cognitive psychology does the job. As I pointed, I don't have much more to say than what I said in the book. I think his going to a certain kind of psychology is also a choice he makes. And in a way, it's circular, because he could have first said, this is the type of psychology that best fits my political ethical commitments, but then you don't need to go to that kind of psychology. So he does try to bank on the truth value that inheres in natural sciences, more sciencey subjects than ours, but in a way that's contradictory as well. So, but that's what I think about that. So ultimately, I think a lot of these dichotomies are obsolete and don't really work. We need to come to a more holistic vision. Wierzbicka, I found what she did, what she constructed as an outsider, being neither a linguist nor, certainly not a linguist, not a social linguist, not anything of that kind. Very impressive, but I couldn't see how historians might work with that. Personally, I couldn't see that. So I just kind of synthesized it in the book, but I thought this is how far it can get. She and Koviches, I think was his name, from Budapest, if I remember correctly. But that's, I think, all I've got to say on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Renata, maybe. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Plamper, for your important and very instructive lecture. My question is not a tough one, but basic one, so to say. What is your opinion about the influence and visibility of theorists who took advantage of simplified essentialist claims that basic emotions such as fear, hatred, belligerence are the drivers of civilization process, starting from Heraclitus to Huntington, or vice versa? Why are neglected those theories who follow Norbert Elias' constructivist argumentation and argue in favor of possibility to improve and refine our civilization with the help of complex emotions? And with complex emotion, I of course mean empathy, compassion, respect for other, which have been promoted rather lately as sociocultural ideals for common conduct in our societies.
Let me make sure I understood. I'm sure it's a very good question, but let me make sure I understood. So you're asking, why is it that for a long time, those theorists who put a premium on negative emotions or aversive emotions, that they were at their heyday were more popular than those who place an emphasis on empathy, et cetera, et cetera.
And they're appearing from time to time as something new to be that intellectuals can brought to public discussion, actually. They are recycled, all new essentialist and simplified theories. For example, like those of Huntington about clash of civilization.
Yes, clash of civilization, yeah. Well, I'm going to have to say the annoying historians thing. It depends on a specific social context. I mean, to me, the question that's of interest is, why is it that in a certain time, you find that a certain theory is mobilized vis-a-vis another that's marginalized. So, so it's a historical question. It's not I don't think I need to. To me, hunting is certainly not a productive way of thinking about emotions. I had never had him on my radar as an emotions theorist in the first place. But anyway, I do note that over the past years, in sort of general public debate, there's been well, if you think of this Dutch historian, publicist. Rutger Bregman, I think is his name, who is writing optimistic books about the future. Being a leftist, coming from a left political economics perspective, but still writing that most people, mobilizing the kinds of studies that show that many people actually cooperate a lot more than rational choice economic theorists tended to say, and so on. But that again would be a historical question. Why is it that someone like Bregman's books suddenly sell rather than others? That's what I've got to say on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I see here Mr. Frog has another question. So
yes,
please.
Thank you for this lecture. This was really fantastic, and I got really a lot out of it. And I was wondering, with your sort of perspective on the history of development of this, of emotion discourse, and how you're seeing it connecting to things like the interest in embodiment, and it's also, it connects with questions of materiality and what's been called the ontological turn and these things. I was wondering if you see any rising trends now that, do you see things that are becoming trajectories that we can expect as directions for the future?
It's a hard one. I think the neurocraze seems to be over, right? The facile appropriation of hypotheses, that's all they are, hypotheses from a couple of articles, and the obsession with a couple of neuroscientists who are the go-to place to talk about major questions that interest us as societies. I think that seems to be a bit over. Sociologists, philosophers have moved back to the fore, seem to have moved back to the fore. So some of the impetus, warning people, as it were, and that I had when I wrote that book back in the around 2010 or so, is gone. I don't know. It's hard enough to try and figure out what happened or what's going to happen in the future. That's really hard. Seems to me that within certain fields, the new vitalist, materialist, ontological turns, the affect studies, and so on, show no sign of abating. They're still very, very strong, and certainly spreading. What's next? Is hard to say. I really can't tell. No, I'm not going to go there. I don't know.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. This has just been wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay. Maybe now we can go back to the second part of the question, my question about what kind of emotions do you find that are repressed at today's societies in order to reproduce themselves. So we feel and know what emotions are in front and almost cultivated. But what do you think about the emotions that are silenced or muted or put aside?
Yeah, I'm not sure that the best way of thinking about this is through Elias and through what is essentially a zero-sum game, right? Where you have the idea that if they're repressed in one place, they'll come out in another, with all the hydraulic metaphors, as Robert Solomon called it. Barbara Rosenwein later did as well. I don't think that it really works that way. So I wouldn't use Elias to think about this question, right? I don't believe in this kind of repression at societal level, at the level of huge social aggregates. It's also too blunt, as it were, for me, too large an aggregation to think about this. Maybe at an individual level, I'm more likely to turn to versions of psychoanalysis, but not at societal levels, or less so. So, but certainly, you're right. Things that one can talk about are, I don't know how prevalent this is in Croatia, for instance, but our students in London at my university until a week ago, Goldsmiths, have switched to the University of Limerick since. About a third to half don't hand in their assignments and claim extenuating or mitigating circumstances, and show us evidence essentially from medical people, from psychiatrists, and so on. And some of what's happening there, it's very complicated, right? Some of it is due to technical reasons, because we work with virtual learning environments electronically. If you submit a second late, it's late, and all you can do is do this. Okay, that's part of the story. But another part of the story is that many of these people used to have, or that in earlier times, there were methods at people's disposal where they used to convert some of their, they used to explain some of their anger and of their real, very well-founded unhappiness about the present through political, social causes, factors. Yeah. And then they used to fight those. And so now we do see this kind of individualization, self-optimization, right? And when we're undergoing, I was telling you earlier, Goldsmith is undergoing a neoliberal restructure. And, we'll get these, as faculty, we'll get these emails where they basically tell us that after the moratorium that the union negotiated, there will be people have compulsory redundancies, will be laid off on March 1st. They'll tell us all of these things. They'll use all of these business speak neologisms, euphemisms, and in the end, they will say, we realize this is an extraordinarily anxiety-inducing time for everyone concerned. Please do consider contacting the Wellbeing Center and signing up for a mindfulness session. So these are the kinds of phenomena, and you as folklorists must know very well that this is the kind of micro stuff where it gets really interesting. That's where I would look, and these are the kinds of settings in which I would think about emotions, not necessarily with Elias, but I would think about certain rechannelings. I would think about why is the conversion of dissatisfaction with a bad politically produced present, why does the conversion to anger and then political action work less successfully than, say, in 1968, to just use a cipher?
Yeah, thank you. We have another one, another question, and then we will have to finish. But here you are. You can ask a question, another one. Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, I think I find some answers in the last minutes of what you were saying here. But I'll ask the question just in case it inspires something in particular. Thank you for the presentation. It was very informative and important to hear in this Congress. I have the program just in front of me, and reading the title, Encountering Emotions in Folk Narrative and Folk Life, I was wondering what would be your, to what would you bring your attention in the field of folk narrative studies and folk life studies, taking in account what you have been telling us today? Maybe it's a general question, but I was thinking maybe you would have a few insights.
Yeah, I don't have any insights from the history of emotions here. I know that folklore studies is particularly concerned with narrative. And I can tell you that when I once did a workshop at Princeton back in 2007, I think it was, a multidisciplinary workshop on fear. And we had an economist talking about 1929, the crash, the stock market crash. We had a horror film specialist. We had a philosopher talking about fear and Kierkegaard, et cetera, et cetera. And we had a novelist, a crime novelist, who many of you will know, Henning Mankell, who died, I think, 2016, Swedish, Scandinavian noir. And he came. And the question that I asked him was, okay, what are the narrative strategies that you use to consciously, deliberately use to invoke suspense, fear in your readers? And I pointed out, he said none at all. He said, I'm just a writer. Basically, he mobilized sort of romantic notions of being a writer. I'm struck by inspiration, God, what have you, and then it flows out of me. It was very funny to see him do that. And then I said, hold on, let me show you. Here's a passage. And I showed him how, look, there are certain narrative techniques that he uses. So for instance, you've got a source of danger, the villain in a hut in the woods. And you've got the protagonist moving towards that source of danger, not knowing that the villain is in the hut in the woods. You as reader, however, are privileged to that knowledge. And then rather than having the protagonist go right to the hut and encounter the source of danger, he inserts a couple of obstacles to slow down this process. And that's what builds up. So you need build up. You need time for fantasy production. And I'm assuming, and this is really just me speculating, that you guys in your field have at your disposal some of the more sophisticated tools to really think about the temporalities that become operative in these kinds of things, right? So I think that's where we could learn from you, actually. And I always thought at that time, I started reading up on Ricoeur and narratology from literary scholarship, but I found something. But anyway, I would love to hear more about what folklore study has to contribute to these kinds of issues.
I'm glad that we maybe in the future can continue our cooperation and finding each other in person. I hope maybe we can have another minute or two to close this, but thank you for your participation and for your willingness to share your historiographic and not just historiographic knowledge about the topic, and introducing us with the main concepts. And thank you for all this. If anyone else has another comment, you are most welcome to have it, but I think they are giving us signs to actually close this session, because we have another General Assembly meeting, which is important in this part of the Congress. So I thank you one more time, and you are, of course, always welcome in Zagreb.
Thank you so much. And thank